If you read the journal Resuscitation, and really who doesn't, you may have seen a recent article titled Resuscitative Endovascular Balloon Occlusion of the Aorta, otherwise known as REBOA. The lead author, Zaf Kassem. Our guest today, Zaf Kassem. He trained as an emergency physician in England. He completed trauma critical care fellowship at the Shock Trauma Center in Baltimore, and now works primarily in the emergency department at Christiana Hospital as a level 1 trauma center in Delaware.
Rob, thanks for having me on the show. It's a real honor.
You may not know this, but I'm a fan of Premier League football, and you did your training in England, so I got to ask you first off, where'd you do your training?
Best city in England, of course, Manchester.
Okay. All right. Well, home to 2 famous football clubs, of course. Did you end up picking one?
Of course. You can't live in the city without picking one, and I kind of adopted Manchester City as my team because I actually ended up being one of their crowd doctors. So not only supporting the team, but kind of combining 2 of my passions, medicine and football. And I'll call it football despite being in the United States now.
You can call it soccer. It's okay. It doesn't matter. This show is slowly becoming the ER soccer podcast. So
all right.
It's all fine. Now, did you ever have any meat pie emergencies?
Oh, majorly. On my first day there.
No, you're kidding me. Did you really?
No, seriously.
Oh my gosh.
Seriously. First day there, unfortunately, City lost. Some people obviously left early, disappointed, and suddenly we're called saying, we'll need the doctor and the nurses and the paramedics. Somebody's collapsed outside. We run out, literally. Nobody cares that we're running through with all our kit, and there's guys lying on the floor. People were so angry that the team had lost, they were just walking around him, walking over him, and there he was in full cardiac arrest.
Oh, my God.
So we start CPR, and I go to his airway. What's coming out? All kinds of meat pie, all kinds of crap.
I guess, was that the chicken or the egg? Did the meat pie then cause some kind of aspiration and choking in the cardiac arrest, or was it just an unwitting bystander?
He got so angry. He certainly wasn't in the shape to tolerate it, having all that meat pie, and I think the 2 confounded to cause whatever happened to him.
All right, well, let's get to REBOA. I mean, that story was pretty close to REBOA, but let's get to the specifics of this show. And I think the best way to explain REBOA, because a lot of listeners have heard of it and have heard it explained, maybe are probably even trained in it and have done it. But I think the majority have probably never even heard the term REBOA. How do you do it? Let's just walk through the steps of I want to do this thing, and I think then we'll get an idea of what it's all about.
First of all, to understand REBOA, and REBOA, of course, stands for Resuscitative Endovascular Balloon Occlusion of the Aorta. So to understand REBOA, you have to know a little bit about the anatomy. So we talk about 3 aortic zones when we talk about REBOA. Zone 1 is from the left subclavian artery down to the celiac trunk. Zone 3 is from the lowest renal artery to the aortic bifurcation. And Zone 2 is the area in between. But we don't really like to talk about Zone 2 a whole lot. That's essentially kind of a no-go zone, because if you inflate the balloon here, you may not occlude the vessel that's causing the bleeding.
Zone 2 is the area between
the celiac trunk and the lowest renal artery.
I sort of understand it. Okay, keep going.
All right. So once you've decided to place REBOA, and we'll talk about indications and contraindications a bit more in a second, the key step is accessing the common femoral artery and putting in a standard 18-gauge arterial line. Next, you're going to be passing a long guide wire up through that arterial line right up to the level of the left subclavian artery. We use a stiff 260-centimeter long wire to do this, and we measure it using external landmarks. If you have time after placing the wire, you'll get a chest x-ray just to confirm its position. And next, you'll replace the arterial line with an introducer sheath. And the one we use is actually pretty huge, 12 French, and that allows passage of the actual balloon catheter itself. You'll need to measure the length of the insertion against your external landmarks, and that's the xiphisternum for zone 1 and the umbilicus for zone 3. You'll pass the catheter over the wire through the sheath and inflate the balloon with saline in the appropriate zone until you feel a change in resistance as the balloon abuts the aortic wall. And at that point, you should see a fairly dramatic rise in the blood pressure.
You're putting in an art line in the femoral artery, and then step, you put a balloon in the aorta.
That's right.
Why on earth would you do this? Who gets this? I would think a pelvic fracture, all the blood's leaking out of the pelvis. Well, you occlude the aorta? That sounds like a good idea. But I've been hearing about it in any sort of hemorrhagic shock, kind of a poor man's cross-clamping of the thoracic aorta without having to crack the chest.
Yeah, so you've hit the nail right on the head. This is essentially an alternative to cracking open the chest and putting a big clamp on the aorta just for the purposes of stopping bleeding below the diaphragm and improving cardiocerebral perfusion. So let's back up a little bit and talk about who's not going to get it. So if you think your patient has some sort of horrible chest injury, like a tamponade or a traumatic proximal aortic dissection, you do not want to put a balloon up there. That's just going to make the patient's day a whole lot worse. You can easily rule those things out with what you do in the trauma bay already, and that's the FAST and the chest x-ray. So if you see a tamponade, you're going to go ahead and open the chest. But if you think the patient has what's termed non-compressible torso hemorrhage, so that's devastating bleeding from areas below the diaphragm, in the abdomen, the pelvis, or the retroperitoneum. And remember, these are places you can't put a tourniquet on or you can't apply direct pressure to. Those are the folks who will benefit from REBOA. This can be from blunt or penetrating trauma or even non-traumatic hemorrhage, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. If you're suspecting that the bleeding is coming from the abdomen, they'll get a zone 1 balloon, and for pelvic bleeding, like you talked about, it's going to be a zone 3 balloon. I think the real beauty of this procedure is that you don't have to wait for the patient to die before you proceed like you do with a thoracotomy. You can actually proactively place this in the transient or non-responder. Since you're being proactive about this and stemming bleeding before the patient undergoes that horrible, horrible insult called death, I think you really have the potential to have a higher percentage of what you really want at the end of this, and that's neurologically intact survivors. And that's what we're already seeing. At shock trauma, we've also placed REBOA in witnessed cardiac arrest. And I think this really needs to be a witnessed arrest for it to be of any use, though.
Not talking a traumatic cardiac arrest. You're just talking a cardiac arrest.
No, so for the purposes right now, we're talking about traumatic cardiac arrest.
Okay.
Yeah. And at shock trauma, we've certainly done this. People have opinions one way or the other. We've seen some good outcomes in patients who have arrested right in front of us from trauma.
It sounds like there's a lot of steps in this. You know, you put this catheter in, you wire up, you say, let's make sure the wire's here. Then you change over to this sheath and all this. It sounds like it's something that would take a while.
Yeah, so people often wonder how long this procedure is going to take. Just as you say, there's a lot of stuff to do with all the wire changes and the device changes. But the answer is that, and we have this data actually from the interim analysis of an ongoing national study called Aorta, is that it's not actually statistically different from the time it takes to do a thoracotomy and get the clamp on right. And this really annoys the naysayers, and the timing is approximately 6 to 8 minutes as evidence from that data. Before you do this, though, you've got to get the basics right. So you've already gotten your IV access, started your damage control resuscitation, placed the pelvic binder, and done all of that. And only then, if they're still circling the drain, so the transient and the non-responder, and you really think that they're about to code, REBOA is your next step to buy them those precious minutes to get to the OR, or in even some cases to the IR suite. But don't forget the basics.
Now, you talk about putting on a pelvic binder, and I'm just thinking about the logistics of this. And, granted, this is a somewhat basic discussion of REBOA, but that pelvic binder is going to be focused on the greater trochanter, right? Like that's where you're going to have the main force. But, they're big straps and sneak up towards the inguinal area. Doesn't that kind of make it hard to put in a femoral line?
Yeah, and we really played around with this a lot. Oftentimes, the pelvic binders that people are going to be using is the T-pod. In other places, they might use another form like the SAM sling. At shock trauma, we were using the T-pod. And initially, we were cutting out a little wedge to allow access to the groin. And then kind of in discussion with our colleagues and our colleagues from orthopedic surgery, we decided to go around it by placing two binders, one slightly higher than you would your usual binder and one just below it to make sure that you're bringing the legs together like the pelvic binder does, but still allowing a space in between those two binders to access the groin.
I have never done this procedure. I've actually never even seen this procedure. The closest I've gotten to Reboa is I saw it hanging in an emergency department that I was touring. So that's the closest I've gotten to this. But I've put in a lot of lines under Seldinger technique. And what would it take for me to go from where I am today, a true neophyte at this, to a Reboa operator?
This is something that emergency physicians can certainly do. But as with any new procedure, it's critical that people get the right training to do it, because it's certainly not without risk. Having said that, Reboa really builds on skills that emergency physicians already have. And that's the use of ultrasound to localize the common femoral artery and the use of a Seldinger technique to insert the various pieces of equipment. Essentially, the first step, placing the femoral arterial line, is something that we've all been trained to do. The caveat is that you have to be sure that you're in the common femoral artery.
You've taught this technique to people. You've talked to people who have done it, you do it. How does it most frequently get screwed up?
So I think the biggest risk is not getting access to the common femoral artery. So whenever we kind of think about placing a femoral A-line, we might do it blindly, just feeling the pulse. More often than not, you end up going much lower than you should. The common femoral artery always lies a little higher than you think, right at that point between the anterior superior iliac spine and the pubic tubercle. So you have to mark out the inguinal ligament, and it's about a centimeter below the mid-inguinal point. So it's always a little higher than you think it'll be. I don't recommend doing a blind stick of it because you'll likely get it wrong, but use dynamic ultrasound and you should be good. And my advice is that go ahead and place the arterial line in your sick patient early when they really have a decent caliber vessel to access. Because if they get better, then hey, you've got a central arterial line, but if not, you've done the time and rate limiting step of the procedure. The next step, so upsizing to the 12 French sheath can be pretty daunting. So think of your usual cordis or introducer sheath, but on steroids. And you have to be really careful to ensure that you're inserting this and not feeling a lot of major resistance while you're putting it in, and also that the dilator doesn't inadvertently get pushed out as you're putting the sheath in. But again, this is another step that we as emergency physicians know how to do and kind of build on those principles to adapt to the Reboa procedure. In the U.S., this technique was trialed and brought out primarily by trauma surgeons. And the reason behind that was not only the way trauma care is delivered in the U.S., but also the high potential for injury when you stick a huge sheath into the femoral artery. Additionally, you can't just pull that thing out at the end of the day, get the medical student or someone equivalent to hold pressure on it while you go get a cup of coffee. No, it needs a formal assessment and closure of the hole made in the artery, as well as ensuring good limb perfusion at the end of the procedure. And that's a skill set that we as emergency physicians don't have. So on the back of that, the initial training courses that came out here in the United States were really also directed at the surgeons, and there were initially 2 in the country. I teach on one of them, and that's called the Basic Endovascular Skills for Trauma course, and that's held down at Shock Trauma in Baltimore. And our candidates are primarily surgeons. We do both simulator and cadaver work with them. And currently, the only emergency physicians that have been trained on our course are those with dual training in critical care and some affiliation with shock trauma. But this will evolve and change, and I think that's mainly for 2 reasons. First, emergency physicians have already demonstrated that with appropriate training, they can safely and effectively perform procedures with big catheters like ECMO. Just look at the Reanimate course that was held recently and the work out of Sharp Memorial in San Diego.
You're talking about Zach Shiner and Joey Hot Bear Belezzo.
Yeah.
Oh, I know. Hot Bear actually now does this so much, he calls himself an invasivist. I just want to say that. Hot Bear, it's a shout out to you. All right, sorry, Zach, go ahead.
So the second reason why I think this is going to change, and this is really the most exciting news, is that back at the end of October last year, the FDA finally approved a new purpose-built device called the ER Reboa catheter. And just to say, Rob, I don't have any financial interest in this device at all.
Why do you have to say that? We just blew our trip to the Bahamas. Right there.
Gosh darn it.
Oh, man. All right, well, go ahead.
So this is a really neat catheter because it can be placed through a 7 French sheath, and that's the size of our usual cordis. Additionally, there's no wire that you have to place beforehand. It's kind of an all-in-one device. So to summarize, yes, emergency physicians can build on their existing skill set to learn this procedure. And with appropriate training and within a system of robust quality assurance, they can be delivering this safely.
Is this ready for the community ED? I know some academic places are using it, but can something like this be used in a smaller hospital that's, far out from the big trauma center? I guess a lot of it has to do with the resources you have beyond the emergency physician, because that's going to be the one constant. I mean, the emergency physician is going to have been trained in an emergency medicine program, regardless of where they're working or be grandfathered in or whatever, have some emergency medicine training. But I guess it's the other stuff, the trauma surgeons, the vascular surgeons, et cetera.
So imagine you're at a single coverage ED and you get an unexpected drop off. A guy who's been in a bad motorcycle crash and he's bleeding out from his abdomen or his pelvis. And you place this device, get control, and you're able to ship them off to the regional level 1. Not only that, but think of the patient with a non-traumatic bleed. I mentioned that earlier. For example, someone who's come in with a ruptured ectopic and is in hemorrhagic shock. The same exact principle applies, and you can use Roboa to buy them time for either your own surgeon to come into the hospital or to get them to your local ivory tower. So that's the kind of ultimate goal with Roboa. But are we there yet? I think not quite. Currently, as you say, Roboa is really kind of based out of big academic centers like the Intergalactic Shock Trauma Center. And these are places that are able to get the patient to the operating room fairly quickly and have that complement of specialties in-house or very rapidly accessible to them to deal with any issues or complications that can arise as a result of placing Roboa. And there's still some issues that need to be worked out before we're ready to say that all community docs within a trauma network will be able to utilize the technology. And those are primarily centered on training as well as systems logistics. But I think one of the major limitations is the timing issue.
What's the treatment arc of Roboa? Like, how long can it stay in? What should be your mindset once you place it?
I need to get this person to definitive care as soon as is humanly possible. These aren't people who will tolerate you scratching your head or rubbing your chin. They're staring you down and saying, I'm sick as hell, fix me. So once the balloon is up, you need to already have a plan in place of how you're going to fix the problem. And so that highlights a couple of things. First of all, you need to limit balloon inflation time. If you're putting a balloon in zone 1, say, and you're occluding flow to everything below the diaphragm, you're taking out a lot of real estate. The kidneys, the gut, even the spinal cord. And your patient's not going to like that. The animal studies and the limited human studies already show that the elevations in lactate are proportional to the duration of your balloon inflation. And the animal studies are showing us that up until about the 40 to 60 minute mark, appropriate resuscitation will clear that lactate. But beyond that, it can really set up a devastating cycle of physiologic injury that you may not recover from. On top of that, when you let the balloon down after a prolonged inflammation, you run the risk of reperfusion injury. Zone 3 balloons are a bit better tolerated, but they still have the same principle attached to them. And the Japanese papers really highlighted this. So the Japanese have been doing Roboa much longer than we have, and their papers are showing some of the complications that are not clearly evident in our limited U.S. data. Their system's somewhat different, though. So they don't see a lot of trauma, and so their surgeons aren't in-house all the time. Their emergency physicians are trained to put in Roboa and then call the surgeon in. And because of this, their time to actually get to the patient to the OR and get definitive care may average well over an hour. And that's one of the reasons I think that the patients from their studies have been showing less than optimum outcomes. The other being they sometimes resorted to using the balloon as a really last-ditch, throwing the kitchen sink at the problem kind of effort. So it goes to further emphasize the timing issue. If you're going to use it early and then get them to definitive care quickly. But I think the second thing that this highlights is if you're thinking of bringing this into your service, you need to train your team to hustle efficiently once the procedure is performed. There can't be any delays because of rubbernecking or high fives that you've done this sexy new procedure. Sure, do that after you fix the problem, but not at the time. Remember, if you're the one doing the procedure, you've got blinders on. You become task-focused. And with that tunnel vision, you lose situational awareness. So this patient is still extremely sick, and they need ongoing resuscitation. And you need to designate someone to take over and lead the resuscitation so that the blood products are still going in, the right services are involved, and the team is coordinated to move this patient to the operating room once the balloon's gone up. So the way I wrote the protocol at Christiana, for example, is that in our trauma codes, the trauma surgeon will move from supporting the senior trauma resident, who's the team leader, to becoming the proceduralist. The emergency physician, who's usually supporting the airway resident at the top of the bed, becomes the designated team leader. So they'll move down to the foot of the bed and provide direct support to the trauma resident and oversee the whole code. Our nurses really help by clearly documenting times of balloon inflation. And in the operating room, the anesthesiologist takes over and with the help from the circulating nurse becomes tasked with reminding the surgeon using closed-loop communication about the duration of balloon inflation so that everyone is geared to limit that time that the balloon is up. And that requires team training beyond just learning the procedural steps.
We talked earlier about doing this procedure. It can be life-saving. Somebody's got a pelvis crush or they've got whatever, you put this balloon in, it's all good. And issues such as not getting it into the common femoral artery or maybe backwalling or injuring the vessel, that can be bad. You're also causing ischemia to real estate distal to wherever that balloon is. So kind of the big picture, but what's the specific stuff, the downsides to this procedure beyond kind of the general things we've talked about?
So one thing I really wanted to highlight as a big potential complication is the risk of critical limb ischemia and loss. And there are certainly reports from abroad of this having happened, although to date, there's no report in the U.S. of any limb loss with this procedure. But the limb is certainly at risk for a variety of reasons. The size of the sheath itself can completely occlude the main vessel of the leg, especially in smaller patients. Also, and you wouldn't have thought that this would happen in people who are so sick, when our surgeons go to remove the sheath, they often see that there's a lot of clot around the sheath itself, and this sets it right up for ischemic and embolic problems. So I think one of the inadvertent benefits of needing to use the large sheath here in the U.S. is that it dictates open repair and removal. So the surgeons really have the opportunity to check limb perfusion right there in the operating room at the end of the case and make sure that flow is appropriate. So be extra vigilant about limb perfusion. Any difference between the two limbs, even a slightly different color, mandates vascular to come and assess that leg again.
Let's take it home with the take-home points.
All right, so I've got 4 main points for your listeners. Reboa is really a promising procedure for managing devastating torso hemorrhage. And the skills really build on what we as emergency physicians already have. But they need to be refined through some more specific training and need to be delivered within a multidisciplinary system having a robust QA process. Balloon inflation times and the potential for limb ischemia are some of the real threats to its use. And finally, both the technology and the data continue to evolve. So collaborate, share your experience, and watch this space.